The airport was a symphony of hurried footsteps and muffled announcements. But for David Harper, it was a vacuum of silence. At 42, he sat at gate 17, his suitcase at his feet, his phone glowing with a message that felt like a knife twisting in his chest. David, your brother will take your place on the trip. We think it's best. Love. Mom and Dad. He read it again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. The dream trip, a month-long journey through Italy, meticulously planned and fully funded by David, was supposed to be a gift. A gesture to mend years of distance. To rebuild what time and resentment had eroded between him and his parents. He'd spent months saving, sacrificing his own comforts, imagining their faces lit up by the Colosseum's glow or the canals of Venice. Now, those images dissolved, replaced by the cold reality of his younger brother, Ethan, stepping into his place. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard, searching for a response. Why? He wanted to type. What did I do? But he didn't. He never did. Instead, he tucked the phone into his jacket pocket and stared at the plane outside, its wings gleaming under the tarmac lights. The ache in his chest wasn't new, it was a familiar companion, born from years of being the dependable one, the one who fixed problems, who paid bills, who stayed quiet. Growing up, David had been the responsible son, the one who helped his parents through financial struggles after his father's business failed. Ethan, 5 years younger, was the charmer, the one who could make their mother laugh even on her darkest days. David didn't resent Ethan for it not then. He'd loved his brother's lightheartedness, his ability to dodge life's sharper edges. But as they grew older, the roles solidified. David became the anchor, Ethan the sail. And their parents, without ever saying it, seemed to prefer the sail. The trip had been David's idea, sparked by a late-night conversation with his mother last Christmas. She'd spoken wistfully of Italy, of her and Dad's unfulfilled dream to see Florence, Rome, and the Amalfi Coast. Her voice had trembled with longing. And David, ever the fixer, had promised to make it happen. He'd worked overtime, skipped vacations, and poured every spare dollar into a fund for their dream. He'd planned to go with them, to share in the joy of their rediscovery. It was supposed to be a moment of connection, a chance to feel like a family again. Now, sitting in the airport, David felt like an outsider in his own story. He thought back to the last family dinner, 2 months ago. Ethan had shown up late, as always, with stories of his latest startup venture, his eyes bright with ambition. Their parents had hung on his every word, while David, who'd driven 3 hours to be there, sat quietly, refilling their wine glasses. He hadn't minded then, or at least he'd told himself he didn't. But now, the memory stung. Had they always favored Ethan? Or was this just another oversight? Another moment where David's sacrifices were taken for granted. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the itinerary he'd sent his parents. The hotels, the guided tours, the dinner reservations, all chosen with their tastes in mind. He'd pictured his father, a retired carpenter, marveling at the ancient architecture. He'd imagined his mother, a former schoolteacher, tearing up at the sight of Michelangelo's David. He'd seen himself beside them, finally part of their joy. Instead, Ethan would be there, probably joking his way through the trip, unaware of the weight behind it. The boarding call for his flight to Rome crackled over the speakers. David stood, his legs heavy, and joined the line. He wasn't sure why he was still going. Part of him wanted to turn back, to cancel the trip and let his parents figure out their own way. But another part, a stubborn, hopeful part, refused to let go. Maybe in Italy, he could find answers. Maybe he could understand why his parents had chosen Ethan over him. Or maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to reclaim his place in their hearts. The plane's engines roared as it lifted off, carrying David toward a country he dreamed of sharing with his family. Below, the city lights faded, and with them, the illusion that he could ever be enough. The streets of Rome were alive with history and chaos, a blend of ancient stone and modern bustle. David checked into his hotel, a modest place near the Pantheon, and wandered out into the evening. The air smelled of espresso and warm bread, and the cobblestones gleamed under streetlights. He should have been here with his parents, pointing out landmarks, sharing gelato. Instead, he was alone, his phone silent except for a single follow-up text from his mother. "Ethan's so excited. Thank you for understanding." Understanding. The word gnawed at him. He didn't understand not the decision, not the casual dismissal of his efforts. He walked to the Trevi fountain, its waters shimmering under the moonlight, and tossed a coin in, a half-hearted wish for clarity. Around him, couples and families laughed, their voices echoing off the marble. David felt like a ghost, present but unseen. He thought about calling Ethan, demanding an explanation. But what would he say? Ethan probably didn't even know the full story, how David had paid for every detail, how much it had meant to him. Ethan was good at gliding through life, unaware of the ripples he left behind. David envied that. In a way, he envied the ease with which Ethan moved through the world, never questioning his place in it. Back at the hotel, David opened his laptop and started typing an email to his parents. He poured out his hurt, his confusion, his years of quiet sacrifices. But halfway through, he stopped. The words felt too raw, too vulnerable. He deleted the draft and closed the laptop. Instead, he decided to keep going, to follow the itinerary he'd planned, to see Italy through his own eyes. Maybe this trip wasn't about fixing his family. Maybe it was about finding himself. The next morning, David boarded a train to Florence. The countryside blurred past, a patchwork of olive groves and vineyards, and he felt a flicker of something new: curiosity, maybe, or defiance. He wasn't sure what he'd find in Italy, but for the first time in years, he was ready to look. Florence greeted David with a golden sunrise, painting the Arno River in hues of amber and rose. The city felt like a living museum, its narrow streets lined with Renaissance ghosts. He walked to the Piazza della Signoria, where statues of gods and heroes stood frozen in time. The weight of his parents' text still lingered, but Florence's beauty was a quiet balm, softening the edges of his hurt. David had always been the planner, the one who mapped out every detail. Today, he followed his own itinerary, the one he'd crafted for his parents. He visited the Uffizi Gallery, standing before Botticelli's Birth of Venus. The painting's serene beauty stirred something in him, longing for connection, for meaning beyond the role he'd always played. He wondered if his parents, now with Ethan, were seeing the same sights, feeling the same awe, or were they too caught up in Ethan's charm to notice? He sat at a cafe overlooking the Ponte Vecchio, sipping espresso and watching tourists snap photos. His phone buzzed a picture from Ethan, grinning in front of the Colosseum, their parents beaming beside him. The caption read, "Living the dream." "Thanks, bro." David's stomach twisted. He wanted to feel happy for them, but the photo felt like a taunt, a reminder of his exclusion. He typed a quick, "Looks fun," and hit send, his fingers trembling. The day passed in a blur of art and architecture. David climbed the steps to the Piazzale Michelangelo, where Florence unfolded below like a painting. He thought about his childhood, about the moments when he'd felt closest to his parents. There was the time he'd fixed their leaking roof at 16, hammering nails in the rain while his father watched, proud but silent. Or the summer he'd worked double shifts to help pay their mortgage, never telling them how exhausted he was. Those moments had defined him, but they'd also built a wall his sacrifices became expected, his presence taken for granted. That evening, in a small trattoria, David struck up a conversation with an older woman named Clara, a local artist who noticed his quiet demeanor. She had silver hair and kind eyes, and her English carried a soft Italian lilt. "You look like you carry the world," she said, pouring him a glass of Chianti. David smiled, surprised by her warmth. He didn't tell her the whole story, but he shared enough about the trip, the text, the ache of being replaced. Clara listened, her hands folded around her glass. "Sometimes," she said, "we give so much to others. We forget to give to ourselves. You planned this beautiful journey for your parents, but maybe it's for you, too." Her words stayed with him as he walked back to his hotel, the city's lights reflecting on the river. For the first time, he considered that this trip might not be about proving himself to his family. Maybe it was about rediscovering who he was outside of their expectations. The next day, David took a train to Siena, a medieval town nestled in the Tuscan hills. The itinerary he'd planned included a visit to the Piazza del Campo, where he sat on the sun-warmed stones, watching children chase pigeons. He felt a strange sense of freedom, unburdened by the need to please anyone but himself. He sketched the square in a small notebook he'd bought, something he hadn't done since college. The act felt like reclaiming a piece of himself, one he'd buried under years of duty. But the freedom was fleeting. Another text from Ethan arrived. "Mom and Dad are loving Rome. You should have seen Dad at the Forum, was like a kid." David's chest tightened. He could picture his father's rare, wide smile, the one he'd hoped to see on this trip. He wanted to ask Ethan if their parents had mentioned him, if they'd acknowledged his sacrifice. But he didn't. Instead, he wandered into Siena's cathedral, its black and white marble dizzying in its grandeur. The cool air inside felt like a refuge, a place to quiet the storm in his mind. As the days passed, David began to notice small shifts within himself. He laughed more easily with strangers, lingered longer over meals, let himself get lost in the beauty of each place. In San Gimignano, he climbed a tower and looked out over the rolling hills, feeling a spark of pride not for what he'd done for others, but for what he was doing for himself. He was still hurt, still confused, but he was starting to see the trip as his own. Yet the question lingered, why had his parents chosen Ethan? The answer felt just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to face them, to ask the questions he'd spent years swallowing. For now, though, he let Italy teach him to breathe again. The Amalfi Coast was a dream carved into cliffs, its turquoise waters glittering under the summer sun. David arrived in Positano, the pastel buildings cascading down the hillside like a watercolor painting. He'd planned this part of the trip for his parents' anniversary, imagining them holding hands on a boat tour, their laughter mingling with the sea breeze. Now, he stood alone on a cliffside path, the wind tugging at his jacket, his heart caught between awe and ache. He checked his phone out of habit, half expecting another photo from Ethan. Instead, there was a voicemail from his mother. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "David, we're in Naples. Ethan's been wonderful, but we miss you. Call us when you get this." He replayed it twice, searching for sincerity. Did they miss him? Or were they just softening the blow? He didn't call back. Not yet. David boarded a boat to Capri, the sea stretching endless before him. The other passengers were families, couples, groups of friends, their chatter filling the air. He felt like an observer, separate from their joy. But as the boat docked and he stepped onto the island, something shifted. Capri's beauty was undeniable: white villas perched on cliffs, bougainvilleas spilling over walls. He let himself wander. No itinerary, no plan, just the rhythm of his own steps. In a small cafe, he met Marco, a local fisherman who spoke broken English but radiated warmth. Over plates of fresh octopus and lemon-drizzled pasta, Marco shared stories of his own family, how he'd left home young, chasing dreams of adventure, only to return when his father fell ill. "Family is messy," Marco said, his eyes crinkling. "You love them. You fight them. You forgive them." David nodded, thinking of his own messy family, the unspoken tensions that had grown over years. That night, in his hotel overlooking the sea, David finally called his mother. The line crackled, and her voice came through, tired but warm. "David, I didn't expect you to be in Italy," she said. We thought you'd stay home after the text." Her words hit like a slap. They hadn't even considered he'd go. He swallowed his anger and asked, "Why, Ethan? Why not me?" There was a pause, long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then she sighed. "Ethan needed this. He's been struggling, his business failed. He's been so lost. We thought this trip would lift him up. You're always so strong. David, we knew you'd be okay." The words cut deeper than he'd expected. Strong. That's what they saw him as: unbreakable, unneeding. He wanted to tell her how wrong they were, how much he'd needed this trip, how much he'd needed them. But he only said, "I'm here, Mom. I'm seeing Italy. I hope you're happy." He hung up before she could respond, his hands shaking. The next day, David drove to Sorrento, the road winding along cliffs that dropped into the sea. He stopped at a lookout, the horizon stretching endless before him. His mother's words echoed, "You're always so strong." He'd spent his life proving that, hadn't he? Fixing their problems, carrying their burdens, never asking for anything in return. But strength, he realized, wasn't enough. He wanted to be seen, not just relied upon. In Sorrento, he visited a lemon grove, the air thick with citrus. An older couple, tourists from Canada, invited him to join their tour. They were warm, curious, and for the first time in days, David felt like he belonged. They shared stories of their own children, their mistakes, their reconciliations. "Parents don't always get it right," the woman, Ellen, said. "But they love you, even when they mess up." David nodded, wanting to believe her. As he walked back to his hotel, the sun setting over the bay, David felt a spark of resolve. He wasn't ready to forgive his parents, not yet, but he was ready to stop letting their choices define him. This trip, this journey through Italy, was his now. He'd see it through, not for them, but for himself. Venice was a labyrinth of water and stone, its canals reflecting the sky like liquid mirrors. David arrived in the late afternoon, the city's magic softening the edges of his hurt. He'd always imagined sharing Venice with his parents' gondola rides. Street, Mark Square, the Bridge of Sighs. Now, he navigated its narrow alleys alone, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He checked into a small pensione near the Rialto Bridge, its walls adorned with faded frescoes. The owner, a woman named Lucia, greeted him with a smile that felt like a hug. "You look like you're searching for something," she said, handing him a map. David laughed softly. "Maybe I am." He didn't elaborate, but her kindness stayed with him as he wandered out into the city. In Street, Mark Square, David watched pigeons scatter as children ran through them. He thought of Ethan, probably charming their parents with his stories. his easy laughter. A part of him wanted to hate his brother, but he couldn't. Ethan wasn't the problem. The problem was the space David had let himself occupy, the dependable son, the one who never complained, the one who paid for dreams but wasn't invited to share them. He took a gondola ride, the gondolier's voice singing softly as they glided through the canals. The water lapped against the boat, and David let himself feel the moment, the beauty, the stillness, the freedom of being untethered. He realized he was starting to enjoy this, not as a substitute for his parents' trip, but as his own adventure. Italy was teaching him to see himself differently, to value his own desires. That evening, he received an email from his father. It was short, almost curt. David, we're sorry if we hurt you. Ethan needed us. Let's talk when we're all back home. David stared at the words, his emotions a tangle of anger and relief. They were sorry, but sorry enough to change. He didn't reply. Instead, he walked to a small bar and ordered a glass of Prosecco, letting the bubbles fizz against his tongue. He was tired of carrying their apologies, tired of being the one who always understood. The next day, David explored the Doge's palace, its golden halls a testament to Venice's faded glory. He met a group of travelers, students, retirees, a young couple who invited him to join them for lunch. Over plates of risotto and glasses of wine, they shared stories of their travels, their lives, their families. David found himself opening up, telling them about the trip, the text, the years of quiet sacrifice. They listened, not with pity, but with empathy. You deserve to be seen, one of the students, a young woman named Mia, said. Not just for what you do, but for who you are. Her words hit hard. David had spent so long defining himself by his actions, his job, his sacrifices, his role in the family, that he'd forgotten who he was beneath it all. He thanked the group and left, his heart lighter. Venice, with its beauty and strangeness, was helping him remember. As the sun set, casting a pink glow over the Grand Canal, David made a decision. He would finish the trip, but he wouldn't chase his parents' approval anymore. He'd see Italy for himself, and when he returned home, he'd have the conversation he'd avoided for years. Not to accuse, but to be heard. Cinque Terre was a mosaic of color, its 5 villages clinging to the cliffs like jewels against the sea. David arrived in Rio Maggiore, the air salty and warm, the sound of waves a constant heartbeat. This was the final leg of the trip he'd planned, the place he'd imagined his parents would love most. Now, it was his, and he felt a quiet pride in claiming it. He hiked the trail between villages, his shoes crunching on the rocky path. The views were breathtaking: emerald water, terraced vineyards, houses stacked like children's blocks. For the first time, David didn't check his phone for messages from his family. He didn't need their validation to feel the magic of this place. He was enough. In Manarola, he sat on a cliff overlooking the sea, sketching the village in his notebook. An older man, a local named Giovanni, joined him, offering a slice of focaccia. They talked for hours about life, loss, the way family can both anchor and wound you. Giovanni spoke of his own estranged son, how they'd reconciled after years of silence. You have to speak your truth, he said, not to hurt them, but to free yourself. David nodded, the words sinking deep. He'd spent his life avoiding confrontation, fearing it would break the fragile balance of his family. But maybe speaking his truth wasn't about breaking it, was about building something new. That night, he wrote a letter to his parents. Not an email, but a real letter, on paper he bought from a local shop. He poured out everything: his love for them, his hurt, the years of feeling invisible. He didn't know if he'd send it, but writing it felt like a release, like setting down a weight he'd carried too long. The next day, in Vernazza, David received a text from Ethan. "Hey, we're in Milan. Mom and Dad keep talking about you. I think they messed up. Man, I didn't know this was your trip." The message was unexpected. Raw. David stared at it, realizing Ethan hadn't known the full story. For the first time, he felt a flicker of sympathy for his brother, caught in their parents' decision without understanding its weight. He replied, "It's okay. Enjoy the trip. Let's talk when you're back." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. David was done blaming Ethan for their parents' choices. The real conversation would be with them. As he sat in a cafe in Monterosso, the final village, David reflected on the journey. Italy had given him more than beauty, it had given him clarity. He wasn't just the dependable son, the fixer, the one who paid for dreams. He was David, flawed, hopeful, deserving of his own happiness. The realization was both painful and liberating. On his last night, he stood on a beach, the waves lapping at his feet. He thought about the coin he'd tossed into the Trevi fountain, his wish for clarity. He'd found it, not in his parents' answers, but in himself. He was ready to go home, not to fix his family, but to be honest with them, to demand the place he'd earned. The flight back to the States was quiet. The hum of the plane a steady backdrop to David's thoughts. He'd spent a month in Italy, following the itinerary he'd planned for his parents. But the journey had become his own. The landscapes, the people, the moments of solitude he'd reshaped him, given him a strength he hadn't known he needed. Back home, David didn't call his parents right away. He needed time to settle, to hold on to the clarity he'd found. He unpacked his suitcase, his notebook filled with sketches, his mind filled with memories. Italy had been more than a trip, it had been a mirror, showing him who he was and who he could be. A week later, he drove to his parents' house, the letter he'd written in Cinque Terre tucked in his pocket. The familiar sight of their small, weathered home brought a flood of memories, good and bad. His mother opened the door, her face lighting up before faltering, as if she sensed the weight of the moment. His father was in the living room, flipping through a photo album from their trip. "David," his mother said, pulling him into a hug. "We didn't know you went to Italy." Her voice was soft, almost guilty. His father looked up, his expression unreadable. "I did," David said, sitting across from them. "I followed the itinerary I planned. It was incredible." He paused, his heart pounding. "But I need to talk about the text. About why you chose Ethan." The room grew still. His mother's eyes filled with tears, and his father shifted uncomfortably. "We thought you'd understand," his father said finally. "Ethan's been struggling. We wanted to give him something to hold on to." "And what about me?" David's voice was steady, but the words carried years of hurt. "I paid for that trip. I planned it. I wanted to share it with you. But you didn't even ask me." His mother reached for his hand, but he pulled back. "We didn't think you needed us," she said, her voice breaking. "You're always so strong, David. We didn't realize that I'm not unbreakable." He finished. "I've spent my life being the one you rely on. But I need you, too. I need to be seen, not just used." The words hung in the air, raw and true. His parents were silent, their faces a mix of regret and realization. David pulled out the letter and handed it to them. "Read this," he said. "It's everything I've wanted to say." He left them to read it, stepping outside to breathe the cool evening air. He didn't know what would happen next, whether they'd apologize, whether they'd change. But for the first time, he felt free. He'd spoken his truth, not to fix them, but to claim his own worth. Days later, Ethan called. "I read your letter," he said. "Mom and Dad showed me. I had no idea. Man, I'm sorry." David believed him. They talked for hours, not as the responsible son and the charming brother, but as equals, rebuilding something they'd lost. In the weeks that followed, David's parents reached out more, their conversations tentative but genuine. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. And David, for the first time, felt like he could meet them halfway, not as the fixer, but as their son, flawed and human. Italy had given him more than memories. It had given him the courage to demand his place, not just in his family, but in his own life. And that, he knew, was the real gift of the journey.